Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us Philip Mary, software engineer at SIOS Technology. Philip, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and today we're going to talk about high availability. How does it fit into your backup strategy? Before we talk about we go deeper into the topic. I do also set some kind of foundation. Can you talk about, because sometimes people these terms overlap: high availability, disaster recovery, backup. So can you talk about how is high availability related to backup?
High availability is comprised of two parts: keeping your applications running and keeping your data ready. So if you think about it like having a primary and a secondary system, your primary system can take all of its data and copy it over to your secondary system in a process called replication. In that way, your secondary system has a backup maintained from your primary system.
Now, when we talk about backups, we talk about hot and cold backups. What is the difference between these two?
So a hot backup is any backup that's connected to power or mounted on a system. You can think of having files across two different hard drives. So if your computer has a C drive and a D drive, and you copy important files from your C drive to your D drive is a hot backup of those files from your C drive. In the same way, that primary and secondary system that I talked about, your secondary system is also a hot backup. A cold backup, on the other hand, is any backup that's on unpowered media. You can think of this like a thumb drive that you carry around with you. So you copy some important files from your computer onto your thumb drive. As long as you carry that thumb drive around with you, on your lanyard in your pocket, that's a cold backup. As soon as you connect it to your computer and it receives power, it becomes a hot backup.
Thanks for explaining hot versus cold back. Can you also talk about how does these two, cold or hot, fit into the overall backup strategy?
So a hot backup, being connected to a system, is sort of ready to go, but it also comes with the risk of being connected to a system where a failure could occur. A cold backup, on the other hand, is something that's much safer, but you also need to have time to be able to connect it to a system and copy the files over. So in that way, there's a little bit of a trade-off in a hot and cold backup, and it's nice to have both.
Once again, thank you for explaining that. Now let's talk about the backup and disaster recovery. How can SIOS DR fit in any organization's backup strategy?
SIOS data replication, or DR, is done with a product called DataKeeper, and that makes sure your data stays up to date and accessible across all of your systems. So in that primary and secondary server analogy that I gave, you already have two backups. Now, many people follow what's called a 3-2-1 backup rule. That means you have 3 copies of your data across 2 different forms of media with at least one of those off-site. That primary and secondary system that I mentioned covers at least 2 of those backups. Then you get some flexibility. You can combine this with routine cold backups from your cloud provider, something like AWS Glacier Storage, and have that stored in a different region from your servers. Alternatively, you could also expand DataKeeper and use it with an offsite third system. So you would have your primary, your secondary, and an offsite third system, which would have some sort of different form of media to write the data to. And in either situation, you're fulfilling all of the tenets of that 3-2-1 backup rule.
Now, I also want to talk about how does kind of SIOS help organizations to lower the recovery point objective, RPO, and recovery time objective, or RTO, in case of failure. But before we talk that, can you also explain the role of each? What do they mean?
Sure. So your recovery point objective, or RPO, is it's the amount of data that you have that could potentially be lost in the case of a failure. The point in which you would be able to restore your systems to, and the image of that data at that time, would be an example of your recovery point, and your objective is just how much you can stand to lose. And then your recovery time objective, on the other hand, is how much time you have between a failure occurring and bringing things back up and running.
Once again, thanks for explaining these terms. Now let's talk about what does SIOS do to lower RPO and RTO in case of failure.
Sure. DataKeeper makes sure your recovery point objective leaves very little data to be lost if a failure were to happen. So we do this with something called synchronous replication. If you go back to our primary and our secondary servers, The primary server is going to copy all of its data and write it over to the secondary system. That primary server doesn't consider the write completed until the secondary system has also acknowledged that the write has completed. With this, that means that you'll have a copy of your data that's maintained in real time across two systems at the same time. LifeKeeper, on the other hand, makes sure your recovery time objective is as short as possible, and it's concerned with your applications. So what it does is it will check your applications periodically and make sure that the applications are running and both have a good environment to work in. If there's something wrong, LifeKeeper can bring those down and bring them up somewhere else.
Can you talk about how do clustering and replication deliver high availability and disaster recovery?
Sure. Clustering and replication are two sides of the same coin. So replication with DataKeeper makes sure your data is present on the primary and secondary sides of your cluster. Whereas clustering with LifeKeeper makes sure you have an automatic mediator to substitute in a backup system if a failure were to occur. When you combine LifeKeeper and DataKeeper, you can be assured that your applications are protected and that your data is accessible no matter where your applications need to come in service. If you go back to our primary and secondary server analogy, your primary server is hosting your applications, and those applications are writing important data to a replicated file system. LifeKeeper is protecting those applications, DataKeeper is replicating that data. If your primary server were to reach some sort of failure, LifeKeeper would bring those applications down, and it would, through a process called failover, bring everything in service on the secondary system. Because DataKeeper's been handling the data replication, those applications have a current copy of the data to work from, and your cluster can continue operation with very little interruption.
Philip, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about, explain actually these the backup strategies, how they can do that, and also how SIOS can help them. So thanks for sharing those insights. And as usual, I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a nice day.